Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, loud and clear? Okay, so we will get started. Welcome. I'm Elora Chaudhary. I'm the chair of the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And it's my great pleasure today, along with the Department of Asian Studies, to welcome all of you and Professor Seuty Sabur, who is going to be giving a presentation on her research. The title is Gender and Social Movements in South Asia, the Changing Political Field. Before I begin the introductions properly, I just want to say a few thank yous to Ellen Noon of the Asian Studies Department and Brittany Downey of the Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies movement, who have very kindly and beautifully prepared these rooms and the AV and everything that makes events like these possible. So a very warm thank you to you. Also a warm thank you to Zach and his associates here recording the lecture. So Professor Sabur is currently an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Economics and Social Sciences at BRAC University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. She obtained her PhD in sociology from the National University of Singapore. She graduated in anthropology from Dhaka University and also has a second master's in cultural dynamics from Hiroshima University in Japan. Her research areas are in Bangladeshi middle class, marriage, kinship, friendship, social and transnational networks, social inequality, intersectionality, social theory, and ethnography. For the past few years, her core research interest has been in the metropolitan middle class of Bangladesh and their lifestyle, changing gender roles, and social and transnational networks. She's published works on this research titled Marital Mobility in Bangladeshi Middle Class, Matchmaking Strategies and Transnational Networks. She's also a very active member of women's organizations and for a long time, since she was the age of 16, in fact. A very vocal member of the queer rights and gender justice movements, both within academia and outside of it. Being an activist and academic and being based in Bangladesh, she has drawn on many recent social movements in her work. If some of you, if you follow South Asian and Bangladeshi politics, you'll know about the student movements and protests around war crimes tribunals and other kinds of democratic and questions that have come up within Bangladesh recently, culminating in the Shahbag uprising, and she's been a very vocal member of that movement also. She frequently writes for the popular media, and I just wanted to read a couple of titles from her recent writings. Postcard from Shahbag. It is the state who needs the holy trinity of nation, nationality, and nationalism as a common enemy. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So you can see very provocative titles. And I'm really looking forward to her lecture. Personally, I just wanted to add a note that this semester, Professor Sabur and I have been teaching hybrid online course. So some of the students in this classroom are from that course, and we just came from a really wonderful, lively, engaging conversation about feminism, autonomy, self-actualization, and it's such a pleasure to have her here in person today and to hear from her. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sabur.
Thank you, Elora, for a generous introduction, and I thank you, Asian Studies and the courses that we are teaching and the students who made it possible, and of course Brittany, who has been integral part of managing everything. And thanks for coming. I will be shifting from reading a little bit and going free flow because I can't do reading very well. So as Elora was saying, I don't want to go in detail of who I am and what I'm doing. I think she has done that. But I will just to posit this paper. This paper was written for Oxford Bibliography, so it's basically a survey study of what has happened across Asia in last 50 years and the scholarship that was produced and how do I engage with those scholarship. So it was written for a very different kind of audience. But I thought, since it's Asian studies and since it's women, gender, and sexuality studies, so I tried to actually combine those and talk about a very wide and general discipline, and rather than me being an anthropologist talking about the specificities. So I'll come back to the specificity, but the way I frame this question is how I'm located as a South Asian feminist, as an anthropologist, and what kind of ontological position and identity that I kind of carry with me, and how do I translate this knowledge and produce certain kind of knowledge or make sense of the world that is evolving around us. So as title suggests, the gender and social movement in South Asia is a broad field. So I will focus my work on India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, not all the South Asian countries. And I will be talking a lot about the political field and the way. Okay, so this is the map of South Asia. If you don't know it already, I'm assuming that all of you kind of know where this place is. So I am coming from South Asia, and I'm located there. So your locatedness kind of gives you or push you to articulate certain kind of politics in a certain kind of ways. And the thing is, there are two things that we have been battling with. One is constantly being surveilled by the Western academics and what we produce, and constantly trying to engage and telling, oh, this is right, or this is wrong, or this is how we see it, or oh, you're not understanding the problem. So that is one thing. And second is India-centricism for South Asian. And the things like India is huge, as you can see. Like, it's big. And it's not big physically, but the scholarship that is produced is lot of them are produced not in India, but about India, where scholars are based in the West. So there's a mediation that is going on. There's a particular knowledge production, the politics of a particular knowledge production system. So which kind of then put me in a position when we talk about South Asia, what do I mean by South Asia, and what kind of knowledge that I want to showcase, because it's a subjective choice, right? So essentially, today's lecture or today's discussion would be revolving around mostly women's movement, not the queer movement yet, because I am talking about the initial articulation of South Asia, and then how it kind of opened up spaces for different marginal positions and dissident voices. And also, it's responding to the West centricity and India centricity, and how not Only India is the center of South Asia, but Pakistan, Nepal, showcasing the knowledge from Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh to give you a picture what is happening and what are the arguments that is taking place around the place. And the thing is, like, when you talk about South Asia, either it is imagined as a village where women are subservient or very quiet, or exotic place where people are dancing happily ever after. Or it's a crucible of development where the garments workers are coming. And this is what you see as South Asia. And, so the thing is, like, should I talk about the NGOs, or should I talk about the garments, or should I talk about the niqabis and hijabis, who are the terror of the world right now, tormenting everyone? So I chose actually to look back in the history to this queen of the rebel queens and the other part of the stories where women are in the public and has always been in public and the field of protest all the time. from a CHIPCO or the mass women's movement into the queer movements that is revolving around South Asia, or the people in the Pakistan who has been fighting for their justice, Asma Jahangir and others, and the things that is going on. So it's going to be in the loop. I hope I can stop it at some point. Very good. So we'll start from there. The construction of South Asia. The construction of South Asia is always intertwined with the colonial past. And colonial past, either it was most of the South Asian countries were colonized either by British, the latest colonial era, either by British for most of the part, or they were the different monarchies were having the legal accord with the British Empire, or countries like Bangladesh, where we were fighting against not only British but with Pakistan. So the emergence of South Asia as an entity is a colonial construction. It is either glorious imagined past of the colony or a post-colonial disaster. That's how it is imagined. And we are talking about a fraught terrain where different kind of politics is taking place, and the gender question has always been part of this nationalist movement and rebuilding the nation and how the world is taking shape. And these stories are very different from one another. Yes, there are shared past, like the empire and the colony and the relationship with the empire and colony, but post empirical South Asia or post-colonial South Asia is a very different entity altogether. It is not a unified field. And so I want to posit that it has never been a unified field. There are South Asia consists of very different kind of people with a different kind of politics. Now imagine the map of South Asia and the people that is located within that map. And imagine it's a field, like physical field. So every person, be it in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, they have their different agenda, and they are trying to actually fight against the class or the ethnic composition or the oppressive culture, and try to make their voice heard. So that is the political field. And when we are talking about the women's movement, we are particularly talking about where women are fighting against the oppressive voice of not only patriarchy, but also class, gender, religion, and other forms of oppression. So the political field, I would use Bourdieu's work, where the field is constituted of different parties who are constantly in battle to achieve certain kind of goal. Okay, so you have in a political field, you have the agents or the actors. So actors are not only individual but also institutions. They're either fighting with the state or against the state, or the transnational forces. So when we're talking about South Asia and political field, we have to understand that we are not talking about a timeless entity or location. We are talking about a specific time in the history, and that time starts from 1950s and onward, after the independence of different South Asian nations. And I would be looking at the different development projects, and not only development projects, but the major women's movement and how it has been articulated in South Asia. And the thing is, one has to remember that this South Asian voices has never been homogeneous. It has never been homogeneous. The movements have never been homogeneous. Yes, women's movement looked very similar, who are always fighting against the patriarchy, but there are multiple layers within that. Okay, so if we go back to the very idea of South Asia, and then moving on to the fact that it was not merely responding to the colonial forces. It was not merely responding to the transnational forces or historical forces. But I want to argue that South Asian social movements, especially the women's movement, actually the actors within the social movements were very sure of what they're doing. And ideologically, they were ideologically led movement. There are different kinds of movement in different kind of time, and these movements were assessing the political field, the state's position, the other organizations and other institutions, and constantly battling against each other for power. And that's what it is. And so if we start from the Indian case, the women question has been very much part of South Asia. Okay, so the women question, so when the nation was built, the gendered narrative was very much part of this conception or imagination of the nation. Okay, so the imagination of the nation was actually, there are two ways, is that who's leading this conversation. It was mostly led by middle class, educated middle class, who actually were occupying the political field. And hence the Dalit voices or the voices from the margin or the other religion was subsided. And so the whole colonial project was to divide the nation into not according to the religion, but also the caste and different kind of ethnicity. So that divided this population within South Asia into different categories. So they are it's not only the elite-led or middle-class-led movements that we are talking about, but there were dissidents within those movements as well. Okay, and the dissidents came from, and the thing is, like, if we look at India's feminist movement, it arrived around the 50s and 60s and 70s. And 80s was actually culmination point when women's movement were taking shape, and it was talking about the violence against women. And if we look at the work of Kumkum Sangari and others, we'll see how the violence against women and the issues like that were actually pandering to the nation state for the how you call it, the law reformation movement. And this law reformation movement were dispensation to the majoritarian need, not the people who were in the margin, who were not upper caste or not Hindu or coming from other indigenous groups. So the thing is, like, it was always majoritarian voice that was coming out. And the thing is, we see that gender and the politics was the movement in India. There were dissident voices within the Indian movements as well. And it revolved around the issues of work, caste, the basic rights and legal reformation, violence against women, and of course the religious right as well. And these are the initial movement that was happening around. And we have to understand, it was not women who were fighting against women, but also it was always women's organization fighting against the state. Now this women's organization, and if you look at the agents and the organization, either they were party-linked, mass-based women's organization, or they were small autonomous women's organization. And if you look at, and I don't want to talk about all of India, but if I'm taking the cases from Calcutta and from Bangalore or from Mumbai, the major metropolitan cities, we'll see there was a left-leaning women's movement, and there was a liberal women's movement, and then there was a feminist groups who were autonomous and bringing in different kind of agendas at the core or in the front. Okay, so, and the thing is, this civil right liberty movement, and looking at the how the women's issues were pushed forward, there are scholarship which actually chart the history of not only middle class and this leading women's organization, but Chipko, Telangana, and other movement which is coming from the margin, which is done by the women of different kind, different. I think one of the photos were there, Chipko movements. So these are the people who were actually fought for the right of reserve forest. And there were mass uprising, which was not middle class. And that kind of, again, opened up the spaces where autonomous movement was possible. And it kind of opened up the spaces not only for the question of women, but about the men and women and transgender issues and open up the queer spaces. So autonomous movement not only talk about the voting rights or the law reformation or suppose the education right for education, but it also focused on how new queer spaces were possible. So suppose in case of Bangalore and Srila's work is one of the example how this new organization, which was career-based feminists, which were pushing the way, they were actually trying to build a bridge between the autonomous organization, which was party-led, which Raka's work also reflect on, and Srila Roy shows us this career feminists, which are part of the lesbian movements in Bangalore or in Calcutta, are showing the way to the autonomous group how not to become corporatized or how not to become universalizing women's movement, but how niche can produce a way to articulate the marginal voices, and not only that, how professionalization can bring radicalize the spaces in the margin. And we see like how women's organization, queer organization have been working, and of course the celebrities have been at the forefront to bring down Section 377 and open the decriminalize the Section 377. So these are the spaces that has been open. Now, sorry, I would be really a little long to give you the trajectory before I can actually jump into my argument. So in case of Pakistan, what were the issues that was tormenting the country? It was after 47. What we see is that there's a autocratic government taking power, and there's a autocratic government not only taking power but also allowing Islamization to happen. So people like Amina Jamal and Farida Shahid and others has showed how women's movement actually in Pakistan arrived from 1980s onward to resist the autocratic government. So when you look at two different countries, their need and the causes for resistance are very different from one another. And Pakistan had to fight back the things like the women that we are talking about from Pakistan, where again was elite and middle class, educated elite and middle class, and some of them were part of the liberal group, some were part of the left parties, and left male colleague actually criticized these women for forming autonomous organization and telling that, oh, it is too West-centric. It doesn't, and so they were not for the Islamization, but they were not for the women to actually have their own organization and resist this Islamic forces, and they were not even helping. Rather, media, state, and the party. So all the agent within the political field was criticizing and was against these women to occupy the field of politics in Pakistan at that point of time. And we see this like an oppressive law under General Zia, where the Hudud law was actually really oppressive, where not only Sharia, but the fatwa was okay. So religious punishment was okay for adultery or any forms of how you call it, the anomaly that Sharia doesn't allow. Okay, so all of this actually kind of opened the space. So women have been battling and they've been fighting for the human rights, and they actually could resist this autocratic government. So, and they were like little relieved when Benazir Bhutto came in power, is that, oh, there's a women prime minister, she's there, so probably women's movement would have a leeway or have a better time. So we see this within the democratic process, what is happening is this co-optation of women's movement here. And with the co-optation of women's movement, what we see is that NGOization. So it is the liberal turn by end of the 80s and 90s that opens the space, and you are resisting Islamist and autocratic, but you are also opening the space to NGO to intervene and West-centric ideas to come in. Now, autonomous voices are being co-opted by this nation, by the state, and the NGO is coming. So political field is becoming almost de-radicalized, where dissident voice was not possible as it used to be. And we know the rest of the history is that these women have been fighting, and especially the case of Asma Jahangir is just heartbreaking, how you fight all these years and then you actually eventually die for the cause. That's what you do. So it has never been easy for women. So, and the thing is, and the history that world shows to us, or the West shows to us, that Pakistan has been an Islamic country and all of these things are happening. But Pakistan has also been very vocal against the capitalism, the feudalism, and the imperialist camp, and everything that was happening in Lahore and Karachi and other places. And the thing is, like, it was in political field was homogenized and co-opted by the state itself. And when state become Islamic, women's organization, doesn't matter how much they fight, it was hegemonized by the state. And the dissident voice was not possible after a point. And we see the effort of the women under the Islamic law. There's a small group of people who are actually fighting both for the Islamophobia and the repressive Islamic womanhood that is bestowed upon women, and they are trying to reinterpret the Sharia law and others, and trying to answer and fight both Islamophobia and this extremist with Quranic text and trying to reinterpret Quran. Now, and it was not really successful attempt, but it was resistance nonetheless, where they were trying to actually change the field and occupy. So from Pakistan, and if we go to Sri Lanka, then Sri Lanka's history is very different, because it was, we see that Sri Lanka's independence was actually, it was left influenced, but then we see how soon after the independence, post-independence, it becomes ethnically divided by Sinhalese and Tamil question, and how women become the body of and the battlefield. And with this, okay, so if we look at the work of Niloufar and others, and Javardhana and others, we see like gender and nation, and the question of gender was absolutely entwined with Sri Lanka's birth. And the thing is, what would be the ideal Sri Lankan citizen, both men and women, has been articulated from the very beginning. And the thing is, when we see that this whole fight and the segregation of communities and the freedom struggle within the Sri Lanka, we also see how within the Tamil Ilm, women's body becomes the marker of ideal feminine character or a masculine character. Even when you are fighting next to one another, it was women whose sexuality has to be surveilled, who as a warrior, the women are in the public. I mean, they were brought into the public, and the left was cheering both men and women to fight for the cause, be it for their Sinhalese identity or Tamil identities, but men and women's role were extremely segregated. And women's body became the ideal marker, and how ideal women would be portrayed, and what would be this whole respectability politics went into and entwined into the narrative of how nations should be formed. And what we see is that women negotiate their way of and intersectional identities, even in post-independent Sri Lanka. And we see that they're not only negotiating, but women also bringing in their feminine role, and where they're actually asking for justice and stop this violences, and actually actually forming mother front, which is a feminine role and a motherhood that you are claiming your social space within a particular political field, being a mother, a specific gender role where you are asking for justice as a mother and disappeared bodies, not for the husbands though as much. So it's very interesting how gendered ideologies are played out in not only nation formation but in nation building as well. And what we see is that people like Rajni Tirangama, and she has been this. So people like Rajni, who has been part of the left political party and who has been part of the Tamil. The LTTE and one of the members, and was married to a Sinhalese left activist, but she was killed by her own people, the left itself. And these are the moment of history kind of make you aware is that women's body is never secure. Even the safest ideological space, the ideological battle is played out through your body. And so that becomes for me that becomes an epitome of this whole thing. A woman who has been working to mobilize, to organize, and being the doctor that she was, taking care of the children and mobilize all the movement, but was killed by her own people. So, and what happens after conflict is over? You see, for nation building, what happens is that when you are building the nation, it kind of allows this neoliberal space to open up as well. So what was your political battle or movement also becomes your gender battle. And the thing is, like, this post-conflict nation, especially in case of Sri Lanka, what happens is that since men were fighting and women were fighting as well, but most of the time it was men, so men were not there. So women not only actually handle their gendered position and identity, but also their ethnic position. It gives them the fluidity to move around freely without men and claiming their social space in a conflict region, but also made them vulnerable and expose them to new kind of vulnerabilities. And that's what happens. And these women are the women who have been targeted by NGOs, who were already free in the political field to become the agent of change, but a very West-centric agent of change. So the caregiving profession, so neoliberal turn and the market is open and make these women and their body as a subject of change, but at the same time it is talking about the care facilities or the garments factory, or its feminization of poverty as well. So the neoliberal spaces are changing the shift in the politics as well, where you are not only organizing to build the country, but also build the country in a certain ways. And that kind of talks about in a language of women empowerment, which is very westernized. It talks about certain kind of entitlement. It talks about certain kind of freedom. It talks about certain kind of mobility, which is okay. But the newer work on Sri Lanka also shows that and it's a beautiful work by a person named the Sandy Heman. And she talks about the suicide that happens in the garments factory, the suicide note. There's a mass suicide that is happening in the Sri Lankan factory. And how the suicide notes are actually a process to show the discontent to the system, the globalized production system where these women bodies are trapped in, but also a way to negotiate their identity and their position, where they are transplanted from rural Sri Lanka to urban Sri Lanka, where they are trying to grapple with the different version of modernity. So we see the different kind of, or the methods of articulating your own identity and organizing. And the political field is changed by this factor in case of Sri Lanka. And Nepal is another conflict-ridden country, which was, in Nepal, if you look at the Nepalese women's movement, it was at the peak during the 1960s and 1990s. And what happens in Nepal, you see the colonial arrangement of the monarchs with British Empire, and to retain their monarchy. And in the 60s, the Rana regime is overthrown, but there's a constitutional monarchy that takes place. And constitutional monarchy is essentially oppressive and essentially Hindu majoritarian regime that is trying to open the space for NGOs and activities. And it also, in the name of rebuilding the nation, what they are doing is they're setting up panchayat, which is led by the Hindu leaders and the elite. And the thing is, the problem is, this panchayat system, well, it's not that people didn't critique about this, but it was the whole political process was so exciting that this regime actually found a way to establish a women's organization who actually talk about the political reformation in the panchayat, so women could be in the public and empowered, and they are doing a great job, because men and women are always they're speaking in the same language that West would like them to. And opening up the spaces for NGO work and other forms of work, receiving the aid. And that changes how the whole political field is actually structured, and the agents within the political field. And what happens is that when the Maoist resistance takes place, it really doesn't question about the elite, because even within the Maoists, though it is like drawing a large number of population from the marginal group. And if you know Nepal's composition, there are so many various kinds of castes and ethnic groups that except for the ideological led movement, it is almost impossible to unite them, because it's so different and so fractured, the political field itself. Now the problem Rita Manchanda and other identify is that the problem of this field was not that the panchayat was there. It was not the problem that the state actually created a women's organization to have the control over women, but the problem was left political parties' silence, how the gender role was articulated, and a left political party's silence not really taking up and not really waiting for this overall structural change, but taking up the women's issue. And that was the problem. And when after the Maoists came into power, we see this revolutionary constitution. And when women are having more power than previous time, but also we see there's a upsurge of different kind of NGO movement that is taking place as well, and that is being integral part of this NGOization, de-radicalization of women's movement in Nepal. And finally, I would come to Bangladesh. So it took me a long time to come to Bangladesh, but yeah. So if we look at Bangladesh, the independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan, is Pakistan from West Pakistan to Bangladesh, was a contestation within the, if you look at the political field, contestation between the subaltern class and the elites, right, or the affluent middle class. And in this social movement, you see the women are at the forefront of this movement, and we see the Mohila Sangram Parishad has been integral part of this movement, which was drawing its membership from the left, and was mass organization of Bangladesh Chhatra Union, or Bangladesh Communist Party and Student Union. And this movement didn't really remain as part of that organization anymore. After 1971, what we see is that it is emerging as an autonomous women's organization, articulating or kind of showing the world that what new women should look like and would look like. So they should be secular, they should be autonomous, and they should be financially independent, politically independent. So that was the motto that Bangladesh Mohila Parishad was pushing forward. And what we see is that by 80s, this women's organization, ASK, or Ain Shalish Kendra, which is a law reform organization, or places like Nari Pokho, the first feminist organization. These women were coming west, they were trained in the Western academia and coming back to Bangladesh and trying to actually reshape how women's movement should be articulated. So there, even though ideologically it was a contested places, but at the same time, in the face of autocratic government in the 1980s Ershad's regime, this women's organization came together and resisted the autocratic regime. And also, similarly, what was happening in Pakistan was happening in Bangladesh. Is like they actually talk about the law reform and fought against the fatwa and the Islamic regime that was coming. So, and the things like you see this ideological fight between the secular and the Islamist, and that kind of shaped how women's movement would be articulated in a particular way. And what we see is that these women's organizations had initially hegemonized the space where they actually managed, without being political, managed to carve the niche for the women, and they become this policymaker and advocates of this women's policy, or Nari Niti, that what we call, and managed to actually have their stake in political empowerment, and managed to actually push their causes through the political parties without being part of any political parties or state to actually talk about certain issues in certain ways. But at the same time, by 1990s, they are also not really completely detached from what was happening around the world. And what we see is that again, neoliberal space is opening up. This women's organization, or autonomous women's organization, had to register under the NGO, in the name of NGO. So there were two types of NGOs, which are like NGO for NGO work, and there was an autonomous organization, women's organization, who having mostly voluntary, providing the voluntary services in Bangladesh, but also pushing certain kind of causes by professionalizing part of it because it was aid-driven. Okay, so we see this whole by NGOization, this women's movement become little de-radicalized, and it would have its impulses only when the Islamic forces are at the forefront. So it kind of not only de-radicalized the space, and there's the contestation of secular and radical, where pushing the women's movement in Bangladesh. But what has happened is that in this field, homogenized field, there are fractures that took place, and we see transgender issues to be articulated. We see queer voices to be articulated. We see marginal voices, Hill Women's Federation and things like that are emerging. And it is so, even if it was de-radicalized, there were new kind of articulation that is coming from in 2000 onward. So on one hand, there's a new spaces for articulation, and there's another place where Bangladesh became this crucible of development. And there's a particular narrative of how women should be portrayed and what women are, what we are achieving. So the lowering the mortality of female child, the mothers, and of course the microfinance, the women are the agent of change. In the case of microfinance and garments factory is all about women empowerment. So it was almost synonymous that NGO and the development in Bangladesh actually happened via women, but also it doesn't talk about the patriarchal nature of this NGOs and the articulation and the portraying of women as a respectable, entitled character or the changes. So what we see is that along with this, there's the Islamic forces that is lurking its way, and we see there's a huge change among the Muslim women who are really getting involved in textual-based piety movements. And these movements are opening space for a newer form of feminism. And what we see is, Ilora Shrabuddin's work, and Ilora Chaudhry, sitting here, my friend, she was talking about how these movements are, the secular forces are actually, yes, they have been working for the opening the transnational spaces, but they also had to respond to Islamic forces that they're faced, and there has to be nuanced analysis of this new projects or the feminist projects. And what we see is that the marginal people are also fighting, and Islam has been one of the way to fight against the elites as well. So the Islamization didn't happen because it was imposed upon them, the Wahhabism or Salafism, but also it was how you call it, the grassroots organizations were subsumed under the different kind of ideological battle that we're fighting. So by saying all of this, what I wanted to say, how I want to conclude, is that the South Asia political field are essentially fragmented, and elite and middle class emerge as the hegemonic voices within this political field. And women question has been at the core of this nation formation. The domestic ideology and gender stereotype of hegemonic class, caste, ethnicity was appropriated within this movement. This led to temporary hegemonization of languages within the women's movement in general, in Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. An autocratic government, conflict-ridden nation-state actually opened up space for neoliberal turn and NGOization. And I also want to argue that strategic alliances in order to resist oppressive regime, forces, autocratic regime, and its allegiance to Islamic forces in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and allowing hudud law or fatwa and law reform, actually these were the strategic alliances of different women's organizations. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually trying to occupy the political space and hegemonize that. It was just alliance for alliance sake. And all of this women's movement have been pandering to the state and donor agency for service delivery. So when we are criticizing NGOization, but we also have to understand that women's organization we're not fighting against each other, but fighting against the state, and the NGOization that we see was one of the tools to use to fight with the state, right? And what we see is that post-conflict nation-state and party-led democratic movements and women's involvement and NGO intervention as a result. And finally, the NGOization and de-radicalization of women's movement under democratic regime kind of actually helped this process of NGOization. So the democratic process actually harmed the women's movement more than the autocratic regime, because it softens up, the whole neoliberal turn actually softens up the language, how you articulate women's movement. And all of this women's organization has one thing in common, is that they are cognizant of transnational forces and carving their niche for indigenous movement in the neoliberal world. That they have been trying to do, and that they are still doing in very different languages. And tension between autonomous women's organization and new feminist group are possible, or making possible the queer spaces to be open. And finally, once we understand the political field and its structure and the actors embedded within it, it is easier to figure out the strategies and issues that we are resisting against. So transversal movement and ideological movement is equally important. So issue-based movement and alliances are important. And I want to argue that not only issue-based movement can make the drastic change, but ideological-led movement has to go along with it. Thank you.
Have about 25 minutes for questions and answers. So if anyone would like to begin with questions or comments, yeah, and you have a question, I'll give you the microphone, and if you can just tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a freshman. My question is a twofold question. I was wondering what you would consider to be the ultimate authority of any religion, because you mentioned that there's different interpretations of the Quran in regards to dealing with women, and in seeing the ultimate authority that you would say, what should be the Westerner or Western nation response to nations like perhaps Saudi Arabia, where women are treated like property? And do you think that there's a possibility that there should be that the similar way where we Western nations retaliated against South Africa for the apartheid? Do you think that there's some similar action can be done there? Thank you.
Well, there's a danger in singularity. And I think I want to start from there, is that I do not believe that there is an ultimate authority to engage with. And I do not think Saudi Arabia, where women are all oppressed, I think we have very different kind of cultural context to understand women's movement. And I think the whole point of this talk was to talk about that, is that there's no homogeneity, be it in the Arab world or in South Asia. Every nation has its own history, and women's movement are shaped by those factors. And any movements, it's not only women's movement, is shaped by that. And even when we are talking about interpretation of Quran, there's no ultimate authority, because I don't want to claim myself as an expert in Quran, but the thing is, like, it is interpretive, like any religion. Ideologies are interpretive in any religion. I think best for West would be to just stay where they are and not to intervene too much, and that's the best way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sabur, for bringing us back to South Asia.
I really wanted to have the space for discussion, because I think because of the composition of the audience, there's so many more, there's so much context to, explain. I know some of you were we're about to die. I was like, why doesn't it end here? But I wanted to, that's why I wanted to really, really summarize the context so that we can have the discussion.
I wanted to mention that we have several faculty members here who have brought their courses, so students who have been in courses that are on South Asian politics. So Professor Sana Haroon's class is here, Professor Aparna Mujumdar's class is here, and Professor Jyoti Sinha's class is also here, they've been studying social movements in South Asia. So I see a hand there, if you want to just tell us who you are. And
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm a sophomore. I was just wondering, in your personal opinion, what do you think the next step is for countries like Bangladesh and India? What do you think the next step is as far as the women's rights movement? It's a broad question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is broad question. And no, but I think it's to do with the issues that I have brought as well. It is really broad. Being an activist and an academic, there is no last answer for me, because we are still trying to find, even within the women's organization that I'm working, and as Ilora was saying, and in the class I also discussed that I am part of this women's organization, Mohila Porishad, and I've been part of that since I was 16, but I also work with the feminist organization, Nari Pokho, and the members of that organization, and the Boys of Bangladesh, the queer group that we have, and the trade union. So for me, I see very different layer, the class, the question that can be articulated, the sexuality question that has to be addressed and articulated. That is addressed in a way within the Nari Pokho, but in a broader field that has to be articulated. We have to talk about the ethnic differences and the hierarchies, and that's why I say it's transversal, or the issue-based movement is important, but at the same time, ideological-led organizations has to be there for a long sustained women's movement. So women's movement that is happening in Bangladesh or elsewhere in South Asia and other part of the world is it's a constant battle, because your response would be based on the question that is coming, or the issues that you are dealing with. I think right now in Bangladesh we are dealing with the de-radicalization of women's movement, and the issue is how newer generations doesn't want to be part of the ideological-led movement, but they're extremely vocal in both old and new media. But they want the individual feminism rather than a collective feminism. So we are trying to mediate that. I think it's a crisis everywhere. It's not only Bangladesh. I don't know whether I've answered your question. Yeah.
I was really fascinated with the notion of the strategic alliance that you were speaking of, and if you could give us examples of cross-class or cross-national strategic alliances emerging in the context of South Asian feminisms.
I would give you an old example from Bangladesh Mahila Parishad. So the things like when Bangladesh Mahila Parishad emerged soon after 1971 and 1972, they were more aligned to the WIDF, Women's Internationals at that point of time, and they were with the left bloc more. And by 80s we see, like after the fall of Soviet bloc, this ties start to fizzle out. Okay, so women's movement, and Mahila Parishad from its beginning, they kind of cut their umbilical cord with the Communist Party. So that is there, and you see a lot of liberal women, left and liberal, are coming in the name of autonomous movement, and they're there. So that connection, or the Sheffield Women's Organization, which was kind of left-leaning, not really left. So there were small grants they would have, like in the name of sisterhood, a global sisterhood. So they were part of this globalized feminist movement, which is not possible anymore, because once you are becoming part of the CEDAW protocol, or you're signing up for CSW, or you're even mandated cases, you are having a very different kind of strategic alliances. So the signatories of CEDAW and CSW, they are coming together, and they are looking at and there's a whole group of people. There's a IRWA watch that formed, which actually looks at how UN mandated programs or the protocols are implemented in nation, and they are giving this every yearly report, the shadow report, along with the state. The NGOs are preparing that report and talking about the state of women and the violence against women in a particular nation state. So that is the strategic alliance that is happening now. So to topple the autocratic regime, all the women's organizations came together. So that is a radical movement. That was a radical time in history where all these women were together, because they say, like, whatever happens, yes, patriarchy is there, but autocratic government is like ultimate enemy of any women's organization. So that very different kind of strategic alliances happen depending on which time we are talking about.
So my name is Michael, and what I kind of understood from your talk is how as NGOs and governments started to sanction organizations and allow them to be acceptable, it kind of softened the radicalism and the dissonance that was happening. So my question is, do you think that is something that can be reignited moving forward in those organizations, or whether new organizations have to be formed and not be operating within like sanctioned ways, as far as democracies or other ways that are not sanctioned now, in order to reignite that dissonance?
So if I am talking from the trope of Bangladesh, it's impossible to exist without being registered as an NGO. So the surveillance is heavy, and surveillance also kind of give you the space whether you can actually take the grants from outside or not. And so there's like a monetary issue is related there. And the moment you are taking the grants and you are operating as an NGO, you have to have the professional structure where there's a monitoring, evaluation, those things are there. And having all of this, whether you still can be radical or not, that's a different question. But that has to be articulated within the organization itself. But NGOization has been a problem, and Elora can vouch for that because she has been closely observing the different projects by Naripoko and others, especially acid survivors, and that becomes a double-edged sword that you are walking on. So I'm not too sure. I don't think only forming new organization would change everything. It doesn't. So change has to happen within the organization itself and outside.
Actually, connected to that question too, I wondered if you want to comment on this so-called fourth wave of feminism. I've been reading some about it, particularly in the context of India, by authors like Srila Roy or Alka Kurian. They've argued that there is a fourth wave emerging, connected to social media, the whole, I suppose, globalization of Me Too. That's something that's coming to mind. But I think we also have another question here.
Okay, I'll take both. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for giving us this sweeping view of South Asia. It's actually very rare to see research that cuts across all these borders, so I really do appreciate the perspective that you're giving us. My question relates to your differentiation of issue-based politics and ideological organization. I think those are the two. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what constitutes ideological organization, and whether you can point to successful instances of issue-based politics to kind of give us a sense of the possibilities there.
I will go back to because I would try to use the same example so that it's easier for us to understand the context as well. So fourth wave in Bangladesh, third wave is still, we are apprehensive whether to take part. Even we are doing certain things in certain ways. So fourth waves, I'm still trying to understand and grapple with. And Me Too is just too raw to even comment on. So I don't want to be the authority to talk about the fourth wave movement, because I think first wave, second wave, and third wave or fourth wave, I see it as a historical trajectories. But it is very context-based and historically located. So I would leave it at that. The question of ideologically based movement and issue-based. So transversal politics, it's near Yuval Davis's kind of articulation where she's pushing to understand gender and nation, she's pushing for a particular issue-based movement and talking about that. Issue-based movement would be for uniform family code. Whether it was successful or not, that's a different question, but we got the women's policy as a result of that. Not exactly what we wanted based on a certain issue, but we saw certain kind of law reform. That happened in India as well. Uniform civil code has been, some part of it was accepted and endorsed by the state. But in Bangladesh, it was not possible because of the reservation of different religious groups. But that would be one of the example where issue-based alliances or the strategic alliances was possible and successful. Ideologically led movement would be the CPM, CPI's sister organization, Maoist movements. And to some extent, Bangladesh Mohila Parishad was actually initially at the inception was ideologically based. They envision a certain kind of society, and there's a particular in Bangla called Gotontantra. So they have a very strict roles and responsibilities assigned for all the members, and how this organization should be working. So it's there. So ideological based movement has been successful in many places in South Asia, even to some extent in Sri Lanka as well. So we see like something as being successful. And the thing is, the reason, and I know it's a sweeping presentation. I mean, it's like really broad. But what I'm trying to, what I've been trying to or attempting to do is to actually not to look at the West to understand feminist movement, but how it is articulated around South Asia, and what are the problems and the troubles that each country has gone through, and what was the responses. So I'm still trying to learn from this movement. So some were successful and some were not. And there is no, remedy for all kind of a movements. And as all of you know, any social movements, even the Occupy movement, you could gather thousands of people, but what it translates into is a different question altogether. And I think decriminalization of 377 is the successful example of how issue-based movement over the years has been pushed forward. And I think one of the slides were giving the trajectory when they started to actually push the cause, and how it was struck down by the state so many times, and how it kind of finally managed to get the verdict that they have gotten. So that is a successful example, a recent example of what is possible, what is unfathomable. What last year or year before was unfathomable all of a sudden became possible. So that is one good example of what issue-based movement can do. And it also teaches other kinds of movement how different strategies can be steered and veered.
Because you mentioned 377, it's funny, there's a paper in this month's issue of the American Historical Review about how the politics of decriminalization of the use of contraceptives here in the United States were actually inspired by the Wolfenden Report in the UK, and that there's this kind of slow 20-year history of the transfer of that idea outside of any established systems or groups or organization. The idea moves over here and comes through. So I was wondering if what were the ideas and what was the philosophy that inspired the legal reasoning for 377, and where was the success of that? What caught hold? What caught the imagination of the judiciary?
I think it's a relentless work of the activist and the legal worker. And constant media campaign that made it possible. There are multiple factors within the political field that has to be maneuvered to achieve certain kind of goal, and that is the point I was trying to make, is that like you have to know, your organization has to know who to ally with and what kind of strategy that you take and how farsighted you can be and how effective you can be. And that is a part of any movement. It's not only about 377, but anyway. In Bangladesh, we started talking about it, and I was part of this program called DHI, which was actually, we were trying to write a manifesto for queer movement in Bangladesh by BOB and other group. But look what happened is that Julhas was murdered, Owen was murdered, just because they were different and they wanted to articulate, and they claimed a political space out in open. And people like me or Sarah Hussain, we have been vocal about it, and Sarah has been working so hard for it. But people have to see you have to, the advocacy, policy and advocacy goes hand in hand. And I know it sounds very cliche, but the thing is, the campaign and how it is strategic. And the thing is, like, being part of the queer movement for so long, I also know that the political aspiration has to be there. For queer community in Bangladesh, it's still very elite-centric. It is still very lifestyle-based movement, but people are not ready. Many of them who are part of the community are not ready to articulate it. Not only sheer fear that they would be murdered, but the things like they're not ready to come out en masse. So political will has to be there to establish the things like I mean, like, doesn't matter how much I love my queer friends, but the thing is, like, they have to feel the need that this has to be done, that this has to be pushed forward. And after Julhas's murder, I think, most of my friends had to seek asylum outside of Bangladesh, and it's unfortunate how you build up for years and you come out slowly and gradually, and then this happens, and then it kind of sets you back. Yeah.
Right, closely following. Right.
Yes.
Seuty, thank you so much for this. I was wondering if you're able to give... I really like the idea of thinking about feminism not as sort of borrowed or cultivated from the West, but as intrinsic to South Asian political movements. I'm wondering if there's sort of a borrowing of feminist activist strategies within South Asia, or between other Asian countries, or between Africa and Asia that you can point to help us sort of think about this. Still a transnational movement, but one that is not reliant on Western epistemologies.
I think one of this would be Sangat and Kriya, two organizations which is trying to have this transnational space for women's movement and different women's movement and organization. And recently I've started working with Kriya, and it's like they're articulating the same problem that I am articulating as an academic, and feeling the need that there's a generational gap in leadership within the women's organization. So Kriya now is working with Nepal, Bangladesh, and India, and trying to actually, in different women's organization, they're not a part of they're not having those multiple branches, but they are working with the different kind of women's organization and the young women activists, and actually trying to have the network so that they can share their personal experiences and political experiences, and can create their own language and how they want to actually shape the political project together. So these are the spaces that's opening up, and they're learning from each other. I think these Sangat, Kriya, these are the two things that I can immediately think of, which is trying to create a South Asia-based strategic network to build on each other's knowledge and have a collective voices, but not the one voice, rather than collective voices within the organization to work. I think it's like people are leaving because they have the classes as well.
Because officially the class time ended at 12:45,
Yes.
so we do have the room until 2. So if there are more comments, or if people would like to come up and meet Professor Sabur, please feel free, and maybe we can officially draw a close to the event at this point. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.